Good evening, everyone. This is a work session of the South Kingstown Planning Board. The date is Tuesday, April 14th, 2026. The time is 6:30. Roll call first. Susan Axelrod.
Here.
Liz Karp.
Here.
Joe Murphy.
Here.
Robin Pothier is absent. Caper Wilson.
Here.
Armand Monaco. And Maria Mack is here. Our first and essentially only agenda item of note is land use Old Tower Hill Road neighborhood project, form-based code discussion as a follow-up to the town council meeting on April 9th. Jamie.
So as a starter, I'll let every planning board member know I have the full presentation from last Thursday night, so if anyone was in attendance and has any questions, there are a few slides we didn't go through, and I'll go through those with you tonight with regards to applicability of the code and when it applies and when it doesn't, because I think that's important. But we, our staff talked Friday morning after kind of decompressing from that meeting, and we had 5 takeaways, and I know most of you were there for the entire thing, so I just want to tell you what we're working on and what we felt our takeaways were and what we need to report back to the town council on. The first item that I have up is clearly articulating how the non-conforming uses and non-conforming parcels are treated in the form-based code and the zoning regulations. And I think most of the planning board members and anyone involved in the permitting side of land use understand non-conforming and conforming lots. And part of it, I think there were a couple members of the public who potentially misspoke, that if your home is destroyed by fire in the form-based code, you get to rebuild it in the same manner in which it existed on the site before, with regards to size and footprint. If you want to expand it, there are provisions that allow you to expand it, but you can expand a building in a conforming nature. So someone to say, if the building burns down, I can't rebuild it unless I adhere to the form-based code is not quite correct. We have provisions for expansions of non-conforming buildings, and I'll go through a few of those in some of the slides we went over last Thursday. So again, clearly articulating what non-conforming parcels and non-conforming uses are. Our existing zoning code is very clear on that, and we're not proposing to change anything associated with non-conforming uses and non-conforming parcels that are in contrary standing with Rhode Island law and our existing regulations. The next item was brought up by a resident, and it's just to review gas stations as permitted use versus special permit versus non-conforming uses under the proposed FBC code. Right now, the code is laid out to simplify things. And I'll just use an example. If you have 50 uses, our current land use code may have 30 retail uses. So it'll say retail. And then it breaks down what retail is. A bookstore, a clothing store, a grocery store, et cetera, et cetera. Aren't they all just retail uses? So the form-based code attempts to simplify things. We just need to discuss with council of where certain things, like a gas station, whether they would fall within retail, whether it was the intent of the planning board to not allow them as a traditional retail use, such as selling a widget. You're selling a liquid widget, but just clarifying those. And if it was the intent of the planning board to allow gas stations as a use within the form-based code, my recommendation would be to look at standards for those. We have 2 existing gas stations, actually 3 existing gas stations within the form-based code area, 1 on Main Street and 2 on Old Tower Hill Road. They're small in nature. I think the largest one has 4 pump dispensers, But I think if you said as a board that we're not concerned about gas stations in the scale and manner in which they exist today, we would formulate a change to the code that clearly articulated that. So in essence, small gas stations, maximum 4 pump dispensers, and we can limit the size of canopy based on dispenser. So if you have, you can say 50 square feet per pump dispenser. So if you have 4 pump dispensers, you can have a canopy of 200 square feet. So it potentially lets you allow to have what you have today, but it isn't opening the door for a mega facility. So, and again, we just want to clearly, review that with you of what the planning board's intent was. Item number 3 is clearly articulate acceptable and non-acceptable architecture. In essence, create those guardrails. I think there's been a lot of discussion on what type, kind, quality, eclectic, non-eclectic, New England coastal, mercantile, kind of mill-like. So again, we have likes and dislikes. We'll be going over those to generate some guardrails. Our intent with the code isn't to call out one specific type, like every building shall have a sloped roof, every building shall have dog shed dormers, every building shall have a cupola. It's offering variety. You may have some flat, you may have some sloped, you may have some sloped roofs with dormers, you may have some buildings with cupolas, you may have some flat buildings. What we're trying to do is have a variety of architecture, but also make it clear that, a building that just vertically and horizontally moves in and out with no attempt, material, color, or style equates to a New England setting and equates more to a urban Boston or an urban Seattle is potentially not appropriate in South Kingstown. So we'll clearly articulate that. The 4th item we had is, again, it's kind of along the gas station route. Look back through the table to review if any existing uses within the existing zones should be carried through. Review definitions and uses for the form-based code. And the owner of the bowling alley made this comment at the meeting on Thursday night. He also made this comment on 2 prior discussions with me. And again, my interpretation of what exists in the code as far as uses is the bowling alley would in essence be a conforming use in the restaurant retail type nomenclature, but that's me as the planning director, Brian as the deputy director. 10 years, 15, 20, 30 years from now, there could be a different person who has a different interpretation. So if it's the intent to allow restaurants with an entertainment component, such as a bowling alley, we can clearly articulate that in the code. And simple discussions were, well, what if bowling went by the wayside and the owner of that property decided to put in 6 golf simulators or 2 pickleball courts? There's no intent to not allow that to happen, so we can clearly articulate that in the code. Unless the planning board says, wait a minute, time out, we don't want golf simulators indoors, and we don't want pickleball courts indoor associated with a restaurant type theme. So again, we can clearly do that. And item number 5 was solidify the setbacks and build 2 lines in each one of the 5 proposed districts in Transco. And again, we've been working with our consultant on that. I had Tracy Owens, who isn't with us tonight because we drew straws for the nice day and did we need 3 planners here, and Tracy won. So she is home with her family this evening. But Tracy's going through using our GIS system and clearly analyzing the buildings that exist in the zones so we can articulate that to our consulting team to make sure that in Transect 1, which is primary residential, that we're clearly making a build 2 line, and Transect 1.5, which is along Main Street, We have variations of buildings between, 10 and 15 feet from the property line, 15 feet from the sidewalk, 16, 17 feet from the edge of road, to clearly articulate that streetscape and what you want for the future. So those are the 5 takeaways that I have from the meeting, and I'll transition into a couple of slides, unless anyone has any questions on those 5 or thinks there's a 6 or a 7.
Well, I had a paper.
One of the things that I heard from the meeting was that there was confusion, certainly among the audience and perhaps even among some members of the council, about what triggers the implications of the form-based code. And I think that, you're talking about specific items that came up, but there seemed to be a general lack of clarity about when that came in. And I think if, in order for this to be, in order to generate a favorable audience.
We have answers for that.
What?
I have an answer for that.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
can
but
take
I
you to
think
that.
that's something that we want to clarify as we move forward.
That was on my list as well.
I mean, I think that's a lot of the mandatory, non-mandatory discussion, I think really is alleviated if they have a clearer understanding of what those triggers are. And then I think that another concern was, if there's some sort of catastrophic event, so that you're set in a position where you have to rebuild. And we were clear it was clear in the discussion that the ability to rebuild was there without triggering any other implications from the form-based code. But styles and everything else changes over time. So, I mean, I think what wasn't clear to me is how much flexibility they would have to deviate. So again, it all goes back to the same issue. What precisely triggers the form-based code? And I think there's a lot of confusion around that.
Susan, did you have?
I think, Caper, you just did a beautiful job of articulating my questions also. There was a lot of discussion about mandatory and what's mandatory and can we enforce mandatory. And I don't know if that's the town council or us or how that determination gets made, but I think that seemed to be on everyone's mind.
I can weigh in professionally. If it is not mandatory, the code will fail.
Oh, no, it's crystal clear to me that it has to be mandatory, but I think that the reason people are so concerned is they don't understand how much flexibility they have to maintain their existing uses and footprints and design capabilities before you trigger form-based code
Okay.
zoning constraints.
I think that there also may be a lesser degree of understanding that the form-based code will actually provide more flexibility, and they currently are constrained by the regulations. They're bound by them, and that seemed to not be part of the conversation.
And just real quick to one of the sites that we looked at. Go ahead, Andy.
Can I interject? We're supposed to have a draft ordinance to the council in a month. 2 weeks, rather, right, yes, 2 weeks. I think we really ought to focus on what needs. We've had these philosophical discussions over and over and over again. I think we need to be looking at the draft ordinance and what things, if need to be changed in the draft ordinance. Like, we should be looking at the exact language of the draft ordinance for the triggering points and see if they're clear or not. I think we got to focus on that. If we spend this time going back over it, we're not going to get forward anywhere.
I think that's a really good point, and I agree with you completely, but I do think that when it gets presented to the town council, we need to focus their attention on what the trigger points are and where that's articulated in the code, so that they have the ability to deal with
Just
the questions that they
The
raised.
town council had all the trigger codes. They had what I'm about to show you.
But they seemed very concerned
cut the
about
presentation
mandatory.
short, and I can't explain whether they understood, read, or didn't read the trigger mechanisms. So,
And
But
to
since
end-
they
review them.
phrased their debate in terms of mandatory versus non-mandatory, it struck me that they don't really understand, or they weren't focused on what are those trigger points.
I do think that both Andy and Jamie certainly were able to articulate why this needs to be mandatory, and I think there may have been a greater level of understanding. But to Andy's point, I think we really need to be able to be discussing things like setbacks and specific things that need to be.
again, let me go over the
Okay.
slides with regards to applicability of the form-based code and those triggers. So, again, we're looking at a code to encourage reinvestment and incremental improvement, avoid imposing redevelopment level compliance on routine renovations and maintenance. Repairs, maintenance, and renovations are permitted. No requirement to comply with the current dimensional standard with regards to frontage, building form, nonconformity must not be increased. Increases occur only after alteration moves the building further from a dimension, placement, frontage, and standard. So what does that all mean? Substantial additions based on building size, thresholds, expansions towards a primary street, new detached principal structures, or substantial demolition of 50% of your exterior walls. So I'll go through one of these. Substantial addition, and I have thresholds for those in another slide. Expansion towards a primary street. So if someone says, I'm going to build my expansion, and I'm allowed 5,000 or 10,000 square feet, but I'm going to build the whole thing towards the street. If it's a 200,000 square foot building, you don't have to make the entire 200,000 square foot building comply with the code. It will just be the expansion will have to apply with the code. Okay?
Right, I understand that, and I think that's actually clearly articulated in the code. I just think that the public doesn't understand it.
Again, let me get through it. New detached principal structure. So if you take something like the Wakefield Mall, and suppose they're allowed a 20,000 square foot building. If they are going to build that in front as a standalone parcel, that building will need to adhere to the form-based code. They just can't, the old photo hut, can't just drop it in the middle of the parking lot. Substantial demolition of 50% of the exterior walls. So if someone's going to tear down half their building, it doesn't mean they have to move the other half. It's just when they do that, their building renovations with regards to elevations, reveals, architecture are going to have to comply with the form-based code. So it means there are trigger mechanisms for that. But if someone's going to re-side their building, change out windows, re-shingle, redo their roof, add a few dormers, that does not trigger the form-based code. With regards to additions, here are the thresholds that were recommended. If you have a 20,000 square foot building or less, you get a 10% increase. So what's a 20,000 square foot building? That's a building a little bit smaller than a Dick's Sporting Goods. It's in that realm. Dick's Sporting Goods are usually about 25,000 square feet. It's like the size of a standalone Michael's, a Staples. It's in that realm. Those are buildings that if they needed a new addition to deal with pre-orders, stacking, warehousing, storage, that a small 2,000 square foot addition could be built. They don't have to, it doesn't trigger form-based code. Buildings that are 20,000 to 50,000 square feet, you get the automatic 2,000 that the prior buildings had plus 2%. Okay, so if you have a 50,000 square foot building, you get an extra get an extra 2%, which is 1,000 square feet, you can do a 3,000 square foot addition. 50 to 100,000 square feet, it's 1,000 square feet plus 4% gets you to 3 to 5. 100,000 square foot building, you get 2% square footage, 3% on top of that, which gets you to a 5,000 square foot addition. So you look at something like the Wakefield Mall. If Shaw's wanted to do a 5,000 square foot addition to accommodate more storage for people ordering online and doing delivery or drive-up service, they could do a 5,000 square foot addition, no form-based code. But if that 5,000, if more than 10% of the square footage came towards the street, you may have to comply. With a 200,000 square foot plus building like the Wakefield Mall, you'd have to do a 20,000 square foot addition, which is 10% of that moving towards the street, so this wouldn't apply to them. Same thing, you look at the 20,000 square feet or less, the McDonald's, the Burger Kings, the Mobiles, those Chipotles, they needed to add walkout cooler space. As long as they're not moving towards the street in most instances, no form-based code. You know, there are other parameters and other zoning codes that exist, but trigger mechanism for the form-based code won't be met. So, and again, that we didn't have, you know, we wanted to hear from the public Thursday night, so this would have taken a little more time to go into. If triggered by additions or expansion, only the new or expanded portion must comply. And I said that as I was going through the explanation. Existing portions may remain. So if you're Ocean State job lot and you need to add on the addition, may not trigger the form-based code, but again, everything else that remains doesn't have to comply. Full compliance is required for the entire structure only when a new principal structure is constructed or 50% of the exterior walls. So we're trying to simplify it as much as possible. Things that do not trigger compliance, interior renovations. I had a business owner meet with me for almost 2 hours, and he was told that if he spends $1 million on renovations to the inside of his building, he's going to have to tear down his building and build a new one. That is false. He could spend $10 million on interior renovations. There isn't a dollar amount that triggers it, and in fact, all interior renovations are exempt from the form-based code. Exterior repairs and maintenance, roof, siding, windows, and facades, doesn't trigger the code. Additions below the threshold and not expanding towards the primary street by 10% do not trigger the code. Exterior alterations with no footprint increase, height increase, or use change requiring redesign doesn't trigger. So if the bowling alley became a really big restaurant, remove the bowling alley, expand the restaurant use, doesn't trigger compliance. It's just a change of use. Doesn't require redesign. Those are the triggers.
Right. The public doesn't know, the public who was here doesn't know that. That was my point.
2 of the 3 businesses represented here are aware of that. And I believe, actually, I should say, one of the 2 was clearly aware that this did not have any implications on his expansion plans or interior, exterior renovations. The gas station owner, our department had not spoken to prior to that meeting. We've extended our information and are willing to meet with them. We haven't received any additional contact. He was a gas station owner and was just concerned about his ability to continually operate his business as either an owner or a new owner. The form-based code will not jeopardize his ability to continue to operate that as a gas station and a service station. The third person, attorney representing Costanza, I think they understand what the code requires their client to do. I think they're in disagreement with the code in general. And their statements about fire were just not correct based on the way the code is written at the present time.
Jamie, will these last few sections that you went over, that language will be in the code that's sent forward
Yes.
versus a narrative that accompanies it.
Yes.
Okay.
And again, the difficulty is we can write it, we can explain it. It's hard to be able to commit to the fact that every member of the public will understand it. Right? That's the difficulty. We're trying to simplify it, break it down in words so that it's more understandable, but we can't assure that everyone will absolutely understand it. We're doing our best.
The other thing is that from the very beginning of the process, there was considerable amount of interest in the fact that this form-based code would solve problems. The overpavement, the dangerous ingress egress, the lighting, the pedestrian safety, green space, and so on. Will those criteria be obvious in the actual text?
Yes.
Okay.
And I think, and I'm going to give Andy credit for this, and I can't remember if he said it exactly, but I think what a lot of people missed in the form-based code presentation and the new model is the fact that these areas are already heavily regulated. In fact, they're regulated to the point that this example of 32 and 36 Old Tower Hill Road, if you went to build what's there today, you can't. The front building on that property that abuts Old Tower Hill Road is within the front yard and side yard setback. Now, in the case of that, if that was a natural disaster, someone would be able to rebuild it on its existing footprint. If they can add on to it in a conforming manner behind it on the interior of the property, but again, they would be limited to, under the proposed code, they'd be limited to the percentage expansion, otherwise they'd have to adhere to the code. So again, the back build, there's parking on the site that's on an adjacent property. You know, changes to this building will require compliance, but again, nothing in the code says that there's, I think, 4 uses here, can't continue. And the fact that the code's adopted doesn't mean they have, 6 months to tear down their buildings and comply. They could exist for the next 50 years in their present format or a format similar to them. So.
So when you were explaining the code to us, you said the statement, as long as they don't go closer to the road, as long as they don't expand toward the road. But I think I've had the impression that expanding toward the road, especially if they're pushing the parking around the sides and the back, is actually our desirable goal. So I feel like we're saying you don't have to do this unless you do this undesirable thing, where we might want to. It sounds like expanding toward the road is a negative. And unless I've misunderstood, that's actually our goal, is to get everything, if there's going to be an addition, let's put it on the front and throw the parking out back, not expand out the back and keep the parking in the front.
So can I can I add a CubeSmart-like building to the front of my building without complying?
No, complying is good. But when we're phrasing it, we're saying, as long as you don't go out the front, you don't have to comply, or as long as you don't go out the front, you don't get triggered.
What?
And I feel like it's just a spin of, like, if you expand out the front, you get to, like, it's being portrayed as a negative. If they can avoid us in all of our silly regulation, as long as they don't go toward the road. And I think it's just, it needs to be spun into being more of a positive, not a negative thing that's going to trigger.
Right. And again, what we're looking at with our consultant is a balance. So we'll look at the Ocean State Job Lot site. If someone were to add 5,000 square feet towards the road, you want that new addition to comply with the code. That's what we're saying. If it's on the side, it may just be an extension of what is already there. So it's not a significant change, but if they're coming closer to the street, we're looking for compliance, and that may just mean architectural, because, you know, you're not gonna pick up and move the whole building forward. So it's a trigger mechanism, but it's intended when it's more front-facing and it's larger, that it will have to comply with certain components of the code that are applicable.
Yes, and I understand that, but I think the last thing we want is more of the same big metal cinder block box building off on the side or behind.
The additions are small, though. They're
Right.
relatively small in
But I
proportion.
think, wouldn't our goal be to have it attractive and attached to the front, to give us that streetscape and that visual? And then also, if they do whatever the square footage that they're permitted to do they get to take advantage of the apartments up top and the, you know, less, like, do they get to take advantage of the good stuff like adding residential? If they don't, do it toward the road or otherwise comply?
No, because if they want residential, then they need to comply with the code, because residential is only allowed with compliance of the code.
And compliance needs to be up front, or it needs to be street-facing.
Or,
If they build a really big, pretty building out in the backyard with a parking out front, do they get to have housing upstairs?
and I would say they need to be code compliant. And we have, and under Rhode Island law, within our regulations and under Rhode Island laws, you can ask for waivers of certain standards when they're done for planning purposes. So you will run across an instance where they're seeking 80% compliance with the code and 20% becomes difficult due to the configuration of the property or a tear down rebuild, where it just doesn't quite fit. Slightly round, square peg in a round hole, it almost gets in there, but just not quite, so an applicant could request a waiver provision. But again, the planning board gets to determine whether it's in the best interest of the community and in the best interest of good planning.
Jamie, will there be some kind of narrative that will accompany this? It seems as though it would be helpful early on in the council conversation to remind them that this is creating a mixed-use zone and will allow housing where we have the infrastructure, the access.
We can ask our consultant if they can prepare a narrative.
Okay.
And again, we'll try and detail the specific, we've had people ask, are you going to supply a red line version of the form-based code and the changes to the zoning code? We're not going to provide a red line drawing. We will communicate where the relative changes are and what those changes imply.
And on your number 3, as far as acceptable and non-acceptable architecture, is it a given no on shipping containers?
From my practical standpoint, I'm not sure how you make a shipping container look like New England, like coastal or something, but to your point, Maria, that if you don't ever want to have that discussion, easier to call that out.
Well, when we had that conversation in Matunic, it was brought up that we actually don't have, because we don't have any architectural standards, that could be something someone proposed on Main Street or elsewhere.
I was going to say, Brian, did you have something?
Yeah, James, I was just going to chime in on the narrative statement or an executive summary of some kind. I think that would be an excellent way for these list of questions that we got from the council to be able to summarize our response and then direct them to the portions of the code that they need to read in order to understand how the code does that. That way, they're not left with a big, thick document and the responsibility of searching through it all by themselves.
So we have those 5 items. One of the other items is, it's clear that the Main Street is switching from a 1.0 transect to 1.5, slightly different architectural standards and setback standards for that zone to maintain it's mostly commercial, but retain some of the forms and shapes of that residential nature. Similar, I would say, similar to what the Neal brothers did in their architectural style. It's just codifying that you would want more of buildings like that and less phone company style buildings. Because someone could argue that's part of the architecture of that corridor.
Have you thought about how this will be presented to the council in terms of format, meeting type, and so on? Is it just going to be an add-on to a busy, regular agenda? How will this?
Yet to be determined. Again, Rory, as the council president, challenged us to, I think, almost turn it around in 2 weeks, which isn't quite 2 weeks. It's literally 7 to 8 days. So based on this meeting, I was going to report back to Mr. Manny about what we can deliver in what time frame. I think Andy would agree that maybe it's 4 weeks, not 2 weeks, of getting this codified into a final draft.
I don't know.
No.
I don't know. I didn't need the mic. I could just shrug my shoulders instead. I mean, that's more up to you than me. That's why I was suggesting, tonight we laser right in on what are the specific language and which specific sections of the ordinance we need to change and fix and get it to them. I mean, you can come back at the public hearing, you can have specific amendments you can introduce at the public hearing if there are other changes that need to be made, but that's between you. I mean, I don't know. I heard the council president say they wanted it on the 22nd. That's up to you as to where you go with that.
What's the time frame for the budget being finalized, out of curiosity? Do we know?
They rescheduled the public hearings, so that's coming up, I believe, next week. And then I think the final adoption is still in early May, so they still have a time frame for that. So again, I'll discuss with the town manager's office, who will speak with Rory about what the expectations are with regards to the next council meeting, their ability to handle this at the next council meeting versus 2 weeks out or at a special meeting.
Yeah, but the next town council meeting is only going to be an introduction. Not going to be any discussion of it. It's basically going to be just an introduction. And then they would have to pick a date to schedule it for a public hearing. So then that council meeting really doesn't need time. If you want more time, don't use that as an excuse, because they don't need time on the town council agenda for the introduction, really.
And then after the introduction, again, often in the regular meetings, there's very limited time.
That I don't know. That's up to
Yeah.
them. I suspect they might do a special meeting, but I don't know.
That would be helpful. Okay. So Jamie, if we, in terms of a 2-week time frame, I think getting back to the board would be helpful, because if you want responses from the board on the setbacks, we would need to have Tracy do that analysis so that we can.
I think what we're looking at is they're already in the code. I haven't seen any planning board members push back on those. We're talking about whether something is 12 feet or 14 feet, whether something is 14 feet or 16 feet. We're moving you know, the width of a table. So we just want to make sure that what we're proposing is in complete alignment, or where it isn't in alignment with what exists, we can defend why it's something different. So again, we're going one step beyond what we've already done to complete that analysis. And I want to say, putting it in layman's terms, if I stood before you and stood 20 feet away from you, and I knew it was 20 feet, and asked you how far away from you am I, most people would be hard-pressed to determine whether I was 20 feet away or 18 feet away. So again, I'm going to defer to our consultant and that architectural team based on the final analysis the final one we do. Again, we're also working off of aerial photos, not surveys. We do have the Neal Brothers analysis, which we're incorporating into our review, which we didn't have when this was initiated, and just looking at that streetscape again.
Right, the streetscape and the ability to add street trees or, you know, various landscaping, that will be important.
Yeah. I think one important thing for us is just clearly was it the intent of the planning board to continue to allow gas stations, or not allow them, or allow them with standards? And the standards would be to, in essence, codify what exists today without allowing that modern megaplex with a gas station, a car wash, a Dunkin' Donuts, a grocery store, a restaurant, a pizza shop.
So you're asking about allowing the use with potential criteria versus grandfathering what exists today and not allowing them going forward? Is that what you're
Yeah,
asking?
I guess your choice would be is if you don't clearly codify it, someone could be of the opinion that they're no longer allowed. They're not traditional retail. They're something other than retail sales. If you codify it, again, we can develop the reg, so if a new one is built, so we have existing ones, and we can allow the expansion of those as a permitted use. But if a new one were to be built, tear down, rebuild, we can also codify that building has to be in the front, pumps in the back, and limit on pump dispensers and canopy size.
Currently, are there either performance standards or special use permit based on the environmental concerns that are inherent in that kind of use?
The environmental concerns are regulated by the state, and you have stream and wetlands corridors in the area, but if you look at the engineering of a modern station, tanks are double-walled, they're monitored, they have to pull them every so many years. It's not the old bury it and forget it scenario of 50, 60 years ago. But again, it is and that's a question that the planning board needs to determine. Are gas stations in your community, in this area of town, acceptable or not? I think you have them now, and potentially allowing them to exist in the manner that they exist today, or a slight reconfiguration of those, building up front, pumps in the back, it wouldn't be any more detrimental than potentially detrimental, I'm not saying they're detrimental today, but potentially detrimental than they are now. Right.
Maria, I think the threshold question you need to start with is whether or not you think we need any more of this use within the footprint of this district. And that if the answer is no, I don't think we need more than 2 gas stations, then making it non-conforming is what you do. And as Jamie said earlier, by making something non-conforming, you're not making it go away. It can stay there in perpetuity, they can maintain it, they can freshen it up. Basically, the only restrictions that we have on non-conforming uses are in expanding them or intensifying them. And even there, under our current ordinance, you have the ability to go to the zoning board and ask for a special use permit for expansions and intensifications. So I don't really see nonconformance as being a drawback. In some sense, it's a benefit because you are eliminating additional competition coming into the district for those particular uses. Now, maybe if you do see the possibility of wanting more uses, maybe you cap the number of uses in the district. We have 2, make it 3. And you know, Jamie and I went through this before. We have 8 gas stations in town. We're not losing gas stations, and we're not counting the other 4 gas stations that are immediately over the line in Narragansett. So we're not going without gasoline, despite what some attorneys writing letters seem to say.
Liz?
No, Brian answered my question. I was going to ask if we could limit the number of usage. I think you answered that.
Again, you can't limit the number of stations, but one thing I'll explore with legal is under the nomenclature of non-conforming. The use is non-conforming. Would you be able to hold the use at the same capacity that you have, reconfigure the site compliant with the form-based code, but in essence, move the puzzle pieces around, compliant with the code, maintain the use? So if you had 2 pumps and a 200 square foot canopy, could you move the building to the front, put the pumps in the back, maintain the 2 pumps, maintain the canopy, and just reconfigure the puzzle pieces? And we'll run that by legal. Because again, it may help the discussion of keeping them potentially non-conforming, allowing the reconfiguration in a compliant manner, and keeping the use within the code. But to, a point council made, if you put it in there as a use that's allowed, you're going to have to come up with fairly stringent conditions under what you would feel that would be acceptable as a use and at what scale and size.
So we do have one of those gas stations out in West Kingston on 138. It's a mobile station.
Mobile station.
And there's a bunch of landscaping out front, and then the driveway's like a horseshoe around the building with the pumps out back. And it's not unattractive from 138. It looks like a little store.
I was on the board when we reviewed that,
Yeah.
and we got them to design it that way,
So
which
if,
is the first.
so if we decided they were non-conforming and they could continue like they were, but one of those gas stations went out of business, would somebody be able to build another gas station on a different site in the district, or would it be just that site? And then how does that work out? And I guess my next question is, if our population in South Kingstown is expanding the way it seems to be, and we do need more gas stations, what other part of town would we feel is a more desirable place to put gas stations than here? Like we don't want them on Main Street, downtown. Like if not here, then do we have to figure out where would be acceptable? If the town needs more gas stations, we don't want them here, where would we want them? Like, does that have to be part of the conversation too? Because we wouldn't want them down on Main Street.
They are allowed in other areas in town, and I would let the private sector determine how they expanded or chose to expand in those other areas.
But this is the busiest, most car-centric part of town. Doesn't this make sense to have our gas stations in this part of town, more so than along our suburban streets?
You have 3.
I'm not arguing it, I'm just wondering.
Yeah, no, you have 3, and those 3 would be allowed to continue in their present format. To answer your question, non-conforming uses are applicable to the lot they sit on and aren't transferable to another parcel.
So it's not like our liquor stores in town where we have exactly 4,
Yeah,
and if one
it's
closed,
not a
you could...
transferable license. It's a use that goes on the particular property. Otherwise, in your analysis, I could take a large commercial use in a commercial zone and transport it to a non-conforming residential lot somewhere in town.
And then the thing I also, at the risk of saying this for the 4th time, about the setbacks, we've got a whole neighborhood over there to the north of Main Street, where a lot of the yard setbacks were really shrunk down in these regulations so that houses could be put much closer to property lines than presently allowed. And I don't know if we've ever really addressed that. And it might just be me beating on that drum every time I get a chance, but we've moved some of those setbacks for those houses right up to the property line. And I don't really understand that, and we've never really talked about that.
I thought we had made some modifications when you changed that to the 1.5.
Yeah, the Main Street zone was changed to 1.5, so we're in the process of codifying that. Are you talking specifically about, Oak Street or?
Holly?
Possibly, that's where, to me, those yard setbacks for those residential houses seem to be much smaller in the new code. But then also, we just had a business come before us on Main Street in the, whatever that commercial neighborhood is, and everyone seemed uncomfortable with how close it was coming to the street. So even though that was been approved and that's an old story, there was an awful lot of pushback from everyone, it seemed, about how close that building was to the street. And I don't know if that's a mistake, but that building.
Sorry, Susan, which building?
It's the one by Hazard Avenue.
Yeah, the one on Main Street, the commercial first floor, apartments on the second floor, parking around the back, next to the architect, Keen Architect.
Okay, that's the Neal Brothers.
Okay. There was a lot of pushback from people on the board and people out in the audience about just how close it seemed to the street and how that felt uncomfortable for people. And I'm not saying yes or no, I'm just saying that there was a lot of pushback on how close that building was presented to be to the street. Like from everybody, there was pushback on that setback.
And again, we're analyzing all of those setbacks along Main Street again, but I think one of the difficulties is you're making a determination, or the council ultimately will, that you are choosing to increase the density in a particular area of town where infrastructure is. So you are determining that that smaller single-family home that occupies a small proportion of a larger lot, that you're going to allow that lot to densify. In order to allow it to densify, you're going to modify the setbacks and you're going to modify the building coverage. And that's how you get increased density. It's allowing change within the district, which any change that increases density has implications of, for a period in time, not being 100% compatible with the house to the left and right of them until the entire street over time changes. So at some point in time, if you look at Main Street, between Stedman's and the gas station and we'll say Citizens Bank, there were always residential homes there, but there were also some swaps where the residential homes were torn down. One-story flat roof retail was put in with parking where the lawn used to be. So that changed the nomenclature of that. Fortunately, like some other communities, you didn't lose the whole street from Stedman's all the way to Citizens Bank. You only lost 2 or 3 properties within that stretch of road. We're trying to bring back something closer to what existed there before, but still allowing an increase in density, which means homes or buildings move a little bit closer to the street, but that will create a new streetscape over time. Again, more attractive than the single retail with cars in the front.
Anything else?
No, I think if there's consensus that you're comfortable with us exploring and making the changes to those 5 items and working with legal and our consultant on revising the draft and submitting it to council, we'll move forward in that direction.
And just to Susan's point, that particular area that she was making reference to in those streets, when you have buildings with a larger mass and scale, which some of the more recent developments do, the setbacks become even that much more obvious when they're decreased.
And to Maria, to your point, I think one of the important parts of the form-based code is as the building moves closer to a road, there is a clear articulation of how the space between the sidewalk and the front of the building is used, either stepping back public-private space, adding the porches or fenestration on the front of the building to make that building more human-sized or pedestrian-friendly. Again, that's what we're trying to finalize. Just circling back real quick on gas station, is there any consensus from the planning board to keep them as non-conforming uses or allow them to potentially be conforming with provisions that keep them, I want to say right size, but size the way they exist today?
Could I suggest that you just leave them as non-conforming? I think it will be a nightmare to try to create an in-between category. If they stay essentially the same, they can do it, they can sell it to new oil companies and so forth. They can update the infrastructure they have without expanding it. And if there's the business for them here, then they'll stay here. That would be my suggestion. Just leave it non-conforming.
But not adding any new.
Well, that you've already done that by your use code. They're not allowed. So no one could come in with a brand new gas station at a different location.
I agree with Andy's suggestion.
In fact, that in a way is making their business more valuable too. If you allowed anybody to come in at on some virgin property or, convert a site to a gas station, that would be alternatives to people buying the existing ones. So I don't think you're hurting the people who have the existing gas stations, and you're keeping it simple.
Anyone else?
So we're done with this, and now we're going to have Jamie work with the consultants to tighten stuff up?
Correct.
And so we are done talking about setbacks and uses and
Unless there's a long,
architecture and all the things on here? Like, we're just basically
Um,
getting a list of things that Jamie's going to work on?
unless there's a longer time frame at which we will discuss it, the details at another work session. Right?
Yeah, to Andy's point earlier, the planning board's been talking about this for, 6 to 12 months. And I think you're at 95% as far as what you understand a building will look like. We're really looking at whether we're moving things a foot or two. Now, and again, we'll be conservative in our approach. So if we pick a build-to line, again, someone has the ability to ask for a slight variation of that for planning purposes, and the planning board gets to decide. But the key is try and clearly articulate what someone can do. And again, you're looking more at building form, and you're less focused on the use within the building. So again, retail's retail, whether you're selling a sweater or a gallon of milk, it's all retail. Or a vacuum or a piece of electronics, it's all retail sales.
Thanks, Jamie. You'll keep us posted. Let's move on to the next agenda item, updates from planning department staff.
Probably one update is we're at probably the 99% phase for draft to our hazard mitigation plan. We'll be putting that up on the town's webpage and in our 2 libraries for a 30-day comment period, hoping to get in front of council. It's not necessarily a public hearing that you hold a meeting in a public setting to allow people to comment on that. But we'll have a 30-day public comment time frame and then look for adoption.
Sounds good. Update on legal, Andy?
Nothing really to report. There's a lot of stuff at the General Assembly that's been held for further study, and I don't know if that's been held for further study because it's going to die, or because it's going to come out just, at a later time with a floor vote the next day. Who knows?
If I could just add, there is one bill, it's House Bill 8004, that's coming up actually for a vote this week, whereby the definition of minor subdivision has been further revised so that it can be with street creation, not just without. No notice to abutters, no review by planning board. And they have also changed the review standards, and they have eliminated the requirement that there will be no significant negative environmental impacts from the proposed development as shown on the final plan with all required conditions for approval. And they've also eliminated the requirement that the subdivision will not result in the creation of individual lots with any physical constraints to development, that building on those lots according to pertinent regulations and building standards would be impracticable. They've also eliminated consistency with the comprehensive plan, and there's also language relative to oversized lots. Just want to let everybody know it's worth having a look at, and if you have any concerns, because
How
this
many
is
lots is that up to?
10.
So, and there's no review at all from the
Nope.
planning board? It's just from the
No notice
administrative
to
officer
abutters.
that meets
Yep.
the requirements?
Yep, and then, of course, the criteria that the administrative officer would act upon is also significantly changed.
That's pretty significant.
Yep. So, okay, anything for liaison activities from anyone? Next TRC meeting? Is this too soon?
No, because if we wait till the next meeting, it's too late.
Yes.
So, it would be May 13th.
May 13th, anyone available? All right, Susan, morning or afternoon?
Morning.
Morning, okay.
Thank you.
I don't know, if they don't appoint me to the next town council meeting, it might not be.
And if there's nothing else, motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Motion from Joe, second from Liz. Yes? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Meeting adjourned.